The bet started as a joke. That was what they said afterward. The lieutenants and the bookkeepers and the soldiers who lined the walls of Vesna Caro's war room every Tuesday at 7 in the morning. They said it started as a joke, the way people always say that about the things that change everything. They say it to give themselves somewhere to stand once the ground shifts beneath them. I know exactly how it started. I was there. My name is Sable Voss, 26 years old, designation Omega, formerly employed as a contract forensic accountant with Meridian Audit Group. Or I was, until the Meridian Audit Group sent me as the sacrificial entry in a government-mandated compliance review of the Caro Group's public-facing holdings. And Vesna Caro looked at the audit schedule, looked at me, and said, in a room of 30 people, "Another one. She won't last." She wasn't wrong about the others. There had been 7 auditors before me in 14 months. 3 had resigned within 48 hours of setting foot in Caro Tower. 2 had submitted falsified clearances and vanished from the profession entirely. I never asked where they went, though I had suspicions shaped like the bottom of a river. One had lasted 4 days, and then been found in her car outside a convenience store 3 miles away, perfectly unharmed, staring at her own hands. She never explained what she'd seen. The last one had actually made it to the 6th day, which was, according to everyone who whispered about it in the industry, a kind of record that no one wanted to beat. A week. No Omega auditor had lasted a week inside Vesna Caro's operation. This was the information my supervisor had not given me when he handed me the assignment. What he had given me was a cardboard folder, a security badge, a bottle of scent-suppressing spray that smelled of industrial lavender and would fool no one, and the cheerful assurance that this was a tremendous opportunity. He had the tight, practiced smile of a man offering someone else to a tide. I took the folder and the badge and the spray, and I did not say what I was thinking, which was that I had $742 in my bank account, a secondary checking account with $31, and a declined transaction from a pharmacy, and a younger sister named Prue, who was midway through a nursing degree at Callaway State on a loan that had my name on it. I did not have the luxury of lasting less than a week. So when Vesna Caro looked at me across that war room table, she was standing. She was always standing at those tables, I would learn, as if sitting required a trust she reserved for nobody, and said, "She won't last." I set down my audit bag, uncapped my pen, and said, "Tell me the terms." The room went very still. 30 people, and not one of them drew a visible breath. Vesna Caro turned her full attention to me for the first time. She had been looking at me the way you look at something you're about to step around. Now she looked at me the way you look at something that moved. She was the kind of beautiful that the gossip columns had been failing to describe for 11 years. They always reached for the same words: ruthless, imperious, devastating. And those words were true, the way a floor plan is true. Technically accurate, emotionally useless. What the columns never said was that she was very still. That the stillness was the first thing you registered, before the dark hair and the pale jaw, and the eyes that were the exact color of the sky about 40 seconds before a storm decides what it's going to do. The stillness was the thing. It was the kind of quiet that costs more than shouting. Her scent reached me a moment after her gaze did. Juniper and struck flint, cold, precise, with a burn underneath that the suppressants she wore could blunt but not kill entirely. I'd been working professional environments with alphas for 4 years. I had a calibrated nose and a practiced neutral face. The neutral face required more effort than usual. "Terms," she repeated. Not a question. You said I won't last. I said tell me the terms. That means there's a bet in this room, and I'd like to know what I'm playing for. A lieutenant near the far wall, tall woman, beta, a scar along her jaw that bisected her cheek in a clean diagonal, made a sound. Not a laugh exactly, the compressed beginning of one. Vesna Caro was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. 7 days, she said. You make it through 7 days of this audit without running, without falsifying, without begging off sick, and without being bought. She said it the way she might read an inventory list. You last 7 days, I cooperate with your audit completely. Full access. Every ledger you want, every office, every account my lawyers have been sitting in front of for 14 months. You go home with a clean report and a completed file. I should have asked about the exit conditions. I should have asked what happened to the previous 7. I should have done a great many things that a person with more choices would have done. And if I don't last 7 days? Then you and your firm sign a non-disclosure and I write a large donation to whatever charitable organization your compliance officer points at. And everyone goes home. She paused. Everyone goes home intact. I want to be clear about that. It was such a specific clarification that it told me everything about what the rumor mill had got him wrong. The previous auditors hadn't been hurt. They'd been bought, or frightened by something they weren't prepared for, or simply crushed by the weight of the thing they'd walked into. Vesna Caro had a reputation built on implications. The implications, I was beginning to understand, were doing most of the work. 7 days, I said. Full cooperation, full access, completed audit. When, I said. The lieutenant by the wall made the sound again. This time it finished. Vesna Caro looked at me for another beat, long enough that I was aware of my scent rising slightly despite the suppressants, aware of the fluorescent hum above us, aware of the 30 people waiting to see what the queen of this particular kingdom was going to do with the thing that had just talked back to her. She set her hand flat on the table. Then we have a bet, Ms. Voss. Sable Voss. Ms. Voss. She did not offer her own name. She didn't need to. Everyone in every room she entered already knew it. The audit begins Monday. My assistant will arrange your access clearance. She walked out. The room exhaled. The lieutenant with the scar stopped beside me on her way past. She was close enough that I could read the faint beta-clean scent of her, cedar bark and machine oil. She looked down at my pen, still uncapped in my hand. She said, very quietly, I've worked for Vesna Caro for 15 years. I have never seen her accept a counterterm from anyone. She walked on before I could respond. I capped my pen. I picked up my audit bag. I waited until I was alone in the elevator before I sat down on the floor of it and put my head between my knees and breathed through the adrenaline for exactly 1 floor. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and got to work. Monday arrived in the steel and glass reality of Caro Tower's 43rd floor, which was where the public-facing accounts lived. Real estate holdings, the shipping subsidiaries, 3 hospitality brands, and a venture arm that had been the subject of the regulator's interest for the better part of a year. I was given a desk in a glass-walled office that faced the main floor so that I could be watched and so that I could watch. I recognized the choice for what it was. A container designed to make the thing inside it feel observed. I arranged my files with my back to the glass and started at the beginning. The accounts were immaculate in the way that accounts are immaculate when someone very intelligent has spent a long time making them look that way. Not falsified, at least, not obviously. Arranged. Sculpted. Every legitimate transaction buffered on both sides by documentation so thorough it would take 3 months to trace one thread to its actual root. I did not try to trace threads on the first day. I made a map. By 11 that morning, I had identified 4 recurring vendor codes that appeared across 7 subsidiaries, with no corresponding service contracts on file. By noon, I had found 2 of the contracts. They existed. They were valid. They were also dated 8 months after the first payment they supposedly justified. By 2 in the afternoon, I had reconstructed the actual payment sequence and found that the amounts, while individually within compliance thresholds, formed a pattern that added up to something considerably more interesting. I wrote nothing down that afternoon. I held the pattern in my head, and I ate the lunch that had appeared on my desk from somewhere, a container of rice with braised greens and a small cup of broth, warm, with a precise amount of ginger, and I went back to the map. At 6 o'clock, as the floor was emptying, I looked up and found Vesna Caro standing in the doorway of my office. She had changed from the morning, or hadn't, I wasn't sure. She wore a jacket the color of a winter road, charcoal shot through with blue, and she was looking at the arrangement of files on my desk with an expression I couldn't yet read. "You haven't opened the HR files," she said. "I'm not starting with HR. Every auditor starts with HR. Every auditor before me didn't last a week." I capped my pen. "I start with the money and I work backward to the people. It's faster." She was quiet. The juniper and flint scent moved through the office like weather changing. "The lunch was from the building's kitchen," she said. "I told them your file said you had a ginger preference." I had mentioned a ginger preference exactly once, in the pre-engagement questionnaire I'd submitted to Meridian 3 weeks ago. The questionnaire that Meridian had presumably forwarded to the Caro group as part of the formal audit setup. The fact that she'd read it, or had someone read it, and remembered one line about ginger was not something I'd been prepared for. It should not have warmed me. It did anyway. "Thank you," I said. She left without responding. The absence of her scent in the office felt like a barometric drop. Day 2 brought the first attempt to buy me. It came from a soft-spoken man named Gervin, who appeared at my desk at 10 in the morning with a corporate credit card and an offer described as a consulting retainer adjustment that would have tripled my annual income in a single payment. He had very kind eyes and the smooth, patient manner of someone who'd done this many times and found it generally effective. I did not look up from the files. "I need the service contracts for vendor group TL7 through TL9, I said. "Physical copies, if they exist." Gervin sat for a moment. Then he left. The credit card went with him. Day 3 brought something I hadn't expected. The work itself opening up. The accounts, once I'd mapped their architecture, had a kind of internal logic. Not a criminal logic, or not entirely, but the logic of an empire built fast by someone who thought faster than her lawyers could document. There were legitimate transactions mislabeled because the category didn't exist yet when the deal was done. There were shell company buffers that were structurally suspicious, but functionally just tax efficiency deployed at scale. There were 2 genuine anomalies that looked intentional, and then, when I pulled the corresponding emails through the formal discovery process, turned out to be the product of a junior accounts manager who'd been quietly embezzling and had since been dismissed. The embezzlement wasn't what the regulators were looking for, but it was real. At 2 in the afternoon on day 3, Vesna Caro appeared at my door again. I had begun to notice that she came at the same hours, 11 and then late afternoon, as the floor thinned, and that she never announced herself and never asked to come in. She simply appeared, and she stood in the doorway, and she looked at the desk. "You found Marin's scheme," she said. I looked up. "You knew about it." I knew the totals didn't reconcile in Q3. I didn't know where it was going. She crossed her arms, and I noticed her thumb moving slowly across the inside of her opposite wrist. Once. Twice. A private repetition. "How long?" 14 months. The figure is... I don't need the figure. There was something in her voice that was not about money. She was 22. She was stealing from you for over a year. She was 22, and she was terrified of something. She paused. I want to know what. It was not the response of a Mafia queen consolidating a ledger. It was the response of someone who'd been frightened once at 22, and never entirely stopped. I wrote the recovery note in the file, and I did not ask what she intended to do with the information. By the time I looked up again, she was gone. The lunch on day 3 was a different dish, miso-glazed root vegetables. The kind of thing that took 40 minutes to prepare properly, with a small separate container of pickled ginger that I hadn't mentioned, but that my questionnaire had implied if you read far enough down. If you were paying the kind of attention that most people don't pay to pre-engagement questionnaires submitted to audit compliance divisions. Day 4 started at 7 in the morning, because I'd woken at 4 with a thread loose in my head. The vendor codes, the dates, the thing I hadn't been able to name yet. I was at my desk when the cleaning crew arrived, and when they left, and when the first associates filtered in at 8:30, blinking over their coffee cups at the woman who'd apparently spent the night here. Which I hadn't. I'd gone home at 9 and come back at 7. A distinction that felt less important as the morning went on. At 9:47, I found it. Not embezzlement. Not the thing the regulators were looking for. Something cleaner than both of those, and considerably more interesting. Vesna Caro had been systematically over-reporting operational costs across her hospitality subsidiaries to the tune of $11 million annually. And every cent of that reported overcost was flowing through a separately structured charitable account into a scholarship fund for Omega children aging out of the foster system in 3 states. I sat with that for a long time. It was still tax fraud, technically. It was also the most elaborately obscured philanthropic operation I had ever audited, designed from the inside to look like exactly the kind of ledger manipulation the regulator suspected. Because the alternative, filing the donations openly, would have subjected the recipients to public identification, which would have subjected 11-year-old Omega children to the attention of the exact organizations that prey on 11-year-old Omega children exiting state care. She'd hidden the good thing inside the bad-looking thing, deliberately, to protect the people it was for. I was still sitting with this at 11 o'clock when Vesna Caro appeared in the doorway. "You're early today," she said. "I found the scholarship fund." The stillness I'd noticed on the first day, the kind that costs more than shouting, settled over her completely. Her hand, which had been reaching for the door frame, stopped. "Ms. Voss, the structure is prosecutable as is. I want you to know that first." I turned the file on the desk so she could see it, but not read it from the door. "I also want you to know that it doesn't have to stay structured this way. There are 5 legal mechanisms for anonymous charitable disbursement from a corporate entity that would not require creative accounting. I can show you all 5. The fund stays. The kids stay funded. The fraud closes." Silence. 8 seconds of it. I counted. She walked into the office. She stood across the desk from me and she looked at the file, and she looked at my face, and something behind her eyes moved the way weather moves before you can name the direction. "Why would you tell me that?" she said. "You could use this." I'm not here to use things. I'm here to audit them. Everyone is here to use things. Then I'm not everyone. I paused. Also, I want to win the bet cleanly. The sound that came from her then was the last thing I expected. Small, brief, and genuine. Not a laugh at something, but a laugh from something. A pressure release. It lasted maybe a second and a half, and then it was gone. And she was looking at me with an expression I still didn't have a word for. 4 days, she said. You've been here 4 days. 3 more to go. She looked at the desk. Then she looked at her hand on the edge of it. She'd placed it there without seeming to notice, thumb tracing the wood grain the same way I'd seen it trace the inside of her wrist. She pulled it back. I'll have my lawyers send you the existing fund documentation, she said. You can review the restructuring options. She left. The juniper and flint scent stayed behind her for a long time, warm now at the edges, the burn underneath closer to the surface. The lunch on day 4 had a note. A small card, typed, that said, "The ginger root used here was fresh. The dried variety affects the taste. If you have a preference for the fresh preparation, it can be arranged." It was such a precise thing to notice. The kind of thing that costs attention. I kept the card. I did not examine too closely why. Day 5 brought Mirella Stoss. She arrived on the 43rd floor at 11 in the morning in a cream-colored coat that was doing a great deal of work on her behalf, with the high, slightly architectural cheekbones of someone who had been called stunning so many times she'd made it a policy rather than a feature. She was an alpha, fir needle and cold copper, very controlled, the scent of someone whose suppressants were calibrated to the top of their range. She walked through the floor with the proprietary ease of someone who'd been here before and intended to be here again. And she stopped outside my office and looked in through the glass, the way you look at something you don't feel the need to explain. Her name, I found out later, was Mirella Stoss, and she had been Vesna Caro's fiancé for approximately 8 months 3 years ago. She was currently the head of a private equity firm that was in active competition with 2 of Caro's subsidiaries. She came to Caro Tower once a month, by all accounts, for reasons that no one in the building articulated clearly. She knocked on my office glass. I looked up. "You're the auditor," she said through the door. "Yes." She opened the door. She did not wait to be invited. She sat in the chair across from my desk and crossed her legs and looked at me with the kind of clinical assessment that strips the paint off things. 4 days, she said. That's further than the others. I'm not the others. No, she cocked her head. What's keeping you here? Because it's not money. You turned down Gervin, and Gervin can be very persuasive. I turned a page in the file I was reviewing. I'm here to do a job. And when the job is done, I'll do the next one. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she won't keep you, you know. Whatever you think is building here, she doesn't keep people. It's not cruelty, it's architecture. She's built everything in her world to be replaceable. I looked up. I'm not a person in her world. I'm an auditor reviewing her compliance status. Mirella Stoss smiled. It was a very beautiful smile, and it did not reach anything above the top lip. Of course, she said. She stood. She smoothed her coat. Congratulations on day 4. She left. I watched her walk to the elevator, and I watched Vesna Caro appear from the opposite corridor, and I watched them see each other. This brief, still collision in a hallway where the air pressure changed. Vesna Caro did not look at me. She walked past the office with her eyes forward. 12 minutes later, the lieutenant with the scar, whose name I had learned was Bex Hartwell, 15 years in the Caro organization, trusted with things that didn't get written down, appeared at my office door. "Morella Stos was not on the approved visitor list," she said. "I apologize. It won't happen again." She didn't interfere with the audit. Bex looked at me for a moment. "No," she said slowly. "She wouldn't. That's not her method." She paused. "She said something to you. She made an observation. About the boss." I went back to my file. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell." Bex made the compressed laugh sound again. It was becoming familiar. "Bex is fine." She turned to go, and then stopped, hand on the frame. "You know what she said about you this morning?" I didn't respond. "She counts things," Bex said. "She counts the seconds and the floors and the exits. She counts like someone who learned to keep track because no one else was going to." She paused. "I've worked for Vesna Caro for 15 years. I have never once heard her describe a person with that kind of specificity inside 48 hours of meeting them." I looked at the page in front of me. It was a column of numbers I had already memorized. "Good night, Bex." "Good night, Miss Voss." The scent of the office, juniper and struck flint, and something that had begun to feel uncomfortably like home, followed me all the way to the parking structure. Day 5's lunch had included a small glass jar of pickled ginger, fresh style, with a handwritten label that said only, "Fresh." The handwriting was not the building kitchen's printed labels. I recognized nothing about it but the intent. I put the jar in my bag and took it home, and ate it over dinner in my apartment, sitting at a counter that needed resurfacing, under a light that needed replacing, in a silence I'd stopped noticing years ago. My phone showed a text from Prue. "How's the assignment going?" And then, 30 minutes later, "You haven't been arrested, right?" And then a string of 3 exclamation points that served as a punctuation of general anxiety. "Fine," I wrote back. "Going well. Don't worry about the arrest thing." She sent back a photo of herself in her nursing program scrubs, giving a thumbs up that was 70% sarcasm. I looked at it for a while. The loan had her living in a 3-person shared apartment with 1 working radiator. She never complained. She sent me photos of her clinical rotations instead, labeled with notes like, "This is what a functioning spleen looks like, in case you were wondering." $742. 2 days left. I put the phone down and went to sleep at 10 and woke at midnight with the loose thread again. Tighter now, almost resolved, and lay in the dark with it until it named itself. The vendor code anomaly I'd mapped on day 1 had a date signature that placed it before one of the subsidiaries technically existed as a legal entity. That meant someone had generated the code and the code's documentation retroactively, not to commit fraud, but to paper over a legitimate emergency transaction that had happened before the legal structure was in place to receive it. An early deal, closed on a handshake, documented backward. Not criminal, embarrassingly human for an empire of this scale. The kind of thing that happened when someone built faster than the infrastructure could follow. I wrote it down in the dark on the notepad beside my bed, the way I've always worked. Capture the pattern before the waking brain can rationalize it away. Then I went back to sleep. Day 6. I was halfway through the morning when Vesna Caro did something she had not done on any previous day. She sat down. Not in the doorway. In the chair across from my desk, Marella Stoss's chair from the day before, which I had already ceased thinking of as Marella Stoss's chair, and she placed her coffee on the edge of the desk with the usual careful precision, and she looked at the files, and she said, "You found something last night." "How do you know I found something last night?" "You have a different look when you've found something. You know something that you're deciding how to say." I considered this. The juniper and flint scent was closer than it had been. She'd sat forward slightly, elbows on the knees, an informality I hadn't seen from her. The burn underneath the juniper was present the way it had been on day 4, warmer than the controlled register she projected. "The retroactive vendor documentation," I said. "Q4 of the founding year." Something crossed her face, quick, low beneath the surface. "The Elvin Street deal," she said. "Tell me about it." She was quiet for a moment, not the stillness of a decision being calculated, but the quiet of something being turned over in private before it was handed out. "My mother died in October of that year. She had been the operating mind of the organization. I was 23 and I had been trained to take over eventually, but not yet. Not like that." She turned the coffee cup 1/4 turn, back 1/4 turn. "There was a supplier we needed. The deal had to close in 48 hours or we lost the relationship permanently. Our legal structure wasn't in place to execute the contract. I closed it personally, on my signature, my personal accounts, before the entity existed." She paused. "The lawyers papered it properly 6 weeks later, when we had the structure. The dates don't match because they can't match. You were 23 and you closed a 7-figure deal in 48 hours while burying your mother." She looked at the window. The sky beyond it was the color of old pewter, heavy with rain that hadn't committed yet. "She would have closed it in 24, she said. "Not boasting, reporting. I'm going to note the documentation discrepancy as an administrative timing anomaly with complete supporting documentation," I said. "It's what it is. It's not what the regulators are looking for." She turned back from the window. She looked at me with an expression I finally had a word for: recognition. The specific recognition of someone seeing something that looks like a shape they already know from the inside. "You've done this," she said. "Covered for someone. Made something work before the structure existed to hold it." I thought about Prue's loan, my name on it, the structure not existing yet to hold her dream. "Once or twice," I said. Vesna Caro was still for a moment, and then she said something I had not expected. "What would you do, if you could do anything, after this?" "After this audit?" "After any of this." She gestured, a small economical movement that encompassed the 43rd floor, the glass, the compliance review, the 7-day bet. If the constraint were removed. I thought about it honestly. Fraud investigation. Not audit, investigation. The kind where you have enough authority to follow the thread all the way to where it goes, not just to the edge of the engagement scope. You're describing prosecutorial work. I'm describing what I'm actually good at. She picked up the coffee, set it down without drinking. "You're good at seeing patterns that people have tried to make invisible," she said. "I'm good at the same thing. We're using the skill in different directions." I looked at her. "Different directions," I agreed. The room held that for a moment. "Last day tomorrow," she said. "Yes." She stood. The chair scraped precisely 1 inch on the floor as she rose, and she righted it without looking at it. The automatic precision of someone who always leaves things as she found them. "The lunch today will be different," she said. I asked the kitchen to try something. If it's wrong, tell me. She left. The scent of her stayed. The lunch was sundu bujige, rich and red and barely contained in its container, with a separate packet of fresh ginger sliced thin and a card that said, "I was told you grew up in a household that made this on Sundays." I asked them to make it close. I had mentioned Sunday soup once, in a passing comment to a colleague 8 months ago at a Meridian team dinner, in a conversation that had nothing to do with ginger or childhood or anything that should have survived the chain of transmission between that moment and this container on this desk. She had not been at that dinner. She had sources everywhere, and she listened to everything her sources said, and she retained what most people would have discarded as noise. My chest did something I declined to name. I ate every bite. Day 7 arrived cold and clear. The sky outside Caro Tower the hard blue of something finished being decided. I came in at 7 again. I wasn't sure why. The audit was complete in all meaningful senses, the final report drafted, the findings organized into the 3 categories my firm would require. I told myself I came in early to check the numbers one more time. I was in the middle of the second check when the day broke open. It broke open at 9:14, when Bex Hartwell walked into my office at a pace I hadn't seen from her before. Not hurried exactly, but clocked, as if she was spending time she'd already counted, and she said, "There's a problem." What kind of problem? The regulatory board has received an anonymous complaint, filed last night, after hours. She put a printed document on my desk. Someone leaked a partial version of your interim notes. The version from day 2, before you found Marin's situation, before you found the scholarship fund. The partial version reads like evidence of systematic fraud. I looked at the document. The leaked excerpt was precise in what it had cut. Everything that exonerated, everything that contextualized, leaving only the architecture of suspicion. "Gervin," I said. "We believe so." He kept a copy of the access card he used to get into this floor. "We found it this morning." I looked at the clock. 9:14. When does the board act on a complaint like this? They'll have a warrant application filed by noon if this isn't countered. Then give me until noon. She looked at me for a moment. "Ms. Voss?" "Bex, give me until noon." She left. I opened my complete file, not the leaked partial, the whole thing. 6 days of work documented in the sequence that showed how each finding had built on the last, with every exculpatory detail in place. And I called my contact at the Regulatory Board's Compliance Division, a woman named Cho who'd reviewed my work for 3 years and knew how I built a case. "Cho, I need to walk you through something. I just saw the complaint come in, Sable. It doesn't look good. It looks exactly as bad as someone wanted it to look. I'm going to send you the complete file. Give me 30 minutes and a phone call, and then make your own judgment." 32 minutes, as it turned out. Cho asked 14 questions. I answered all 14 with citations to the documented evidence. By 10:20, Cho had what she needed to file a counterbrief with the board. At 10:30, I found the piece I hadn't been looking for. The access card Gervin had kept from the security system. Bex had sent me the log as part of the incident documentation. Gervin's card had accessed the server room on the 38th floor twice in the past week, at 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. respectively. The server room on the 38th floor held the backup copies of the internal communications archive. The communications archive was outside my formal audit scope, outside the specific mandate I'd been given, but it was inside the building's legal entity structure, and therefore subject to the emergency regulatory discovery motion that Cho was, even now, filing on my behalf. I sent Bex the server room timestamps with a single note. Pull the archive access logs for these times. Don't touch the content, just the access history. 8 minutes later, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't been given formally. I knew it was hers before I answered. The access logs, Vesna Caro said. Not a question. He wasn't just copying my notes. He was pulling internal communication records. If those records exist and they show what I think they show Morella. The word landed like a key in a lock. She sent him into this building. The flat certainty in Vesna Caro's voice was the kind that comes from having already known the shape of the thing before the evidence confirms it. She's been building a regulatory case against me for 8 months, using someone I employed, someone I trusted with the floor. If Gervin pulled those records, they exist, I said. The regulatory board's emergency motion will capture them. How long? Cho is filing now. 2 hours, maybe less, to compel the server access log. The content of the archive takes longer. The archive I've already sent to my legal team, Vesna Caro said, under our own discovery capture, which preceded your board's motion by 6 minutes. I sat back. You already knew. I suspected. I've suspected something from inside for 3 weeks. I've been waiting for a thread I could follow without alerting her. A pause. You gave me the thread this morning. The server room timestamps. Yes. We were quiet for a moment. The phone line hummed faintly, a sound like distance being measured. Gervin is being held in the building's security office, she said. My lawyers are on their way. The regulatory board will have what they need to close the complaint by noon. And Morella Stoss will be arrested. Without inflection. The evidence is complete. I held the phone and thought about Morella Stoss's face when she'd said, "She won't keep you." The way she'd said it, with the confidence of someone who'd been engineering the conditions. The way she'd looked at my office through the glass, not as a warning, but as an assessment of what I'd found, and whether it could be weaponized before I got to the end. She used my audit as a vector, I said. She waited until I was inside the organization and then tried to use the partial findings to accelerate the regulatory case she'd been building. Yes. She couldn't buy me through Gervin, so she used what he could take. Yes. She underestimated how far along I was. Everyone, Vesna Caro said, very precisely, underestimates you. I watched them do it all week. The phone line hummed. Day 7, I said. Yes. A pause. You've lasted your week, Ms. Voss. I told you when. You did. And then, after a silence that had weight and texture, and the particular quality of something being allowed for the first time, Sable. My name in her voice was a different object than it had been when she'd read it off the security clearance on day 1. I did not say anything about this. There were still 3 hours of work to complete, a regulatory board to brief, a final audit report to file, and a firm principal who would want a full debrief before end of business. I was a professional. I had a job to do. I'll have the final report filed by 4, I said. I know you will. Another pause. The lunch today will be late. I hope that's acceptable. I'll manage. You always do. She ended the call. I picked up my pen. I started at the beginning of the final report, and I worked forward, the way I always do, And I did not let myself think about the specific quality of my name in her voice, or the way the juniper and flint scent had grown warmer across the 7 days, the way weather warms incrementally before you can name the season that's coming. I worked forward. I filed the report at 3:48. The lunch arrived at 4:15, a container of rice with braised greens and a small cup of broth, warm with fresh ginger. The first thing she'd sent, a circle completed. There was no card this time. There didn't need to be. 6 weeks passed before I saw her again. The audit closed cleanly, full cooperation, full access, completed compliance certification filed with the regulatory board. Cho called me to say it was the most thorough engagement her division had received in 4 years. My firm principal called me to say I'd be leading the next major engagement. Gervin accepted a plea arrangement. Morella Stos was arrested on charges of corporate espionage and securities fraud on a Thursday morning and was photographed leaving the magistrate's building in the cream-colored coat, which no longer looked like it was doing nearly as much work. I thought about Vesna Caro approximately 11 times a day. I did not examine this too closely. On the 42nd day after the audit closed, I received an envelope by courier. Heavy cream paper, no letterhead. A single folded card inside with a note typed in a font that was doing its best to look like a real typewriter had made it. The note said, "There's a fraud investigation position at the Caro Group. Internal. Full prosecutorial authority within the organization's scope. The kind where you follow the thread all the way to where it goes. If you're interested, the office on the 43rd floor is still available. It is, I'm told, a good desk. VC." I read it twice. I put it down. I picked it up and read it a third time. I typed my resignation from Meridian in 20 minutes. The professional, grateful kind that leaves doors open, and I sent it before I could think myself out of the impulse. Then I called Prue. "The assignment went well," I said. "Yeah? How well?" "There might be a development." A long pause. "Sable, it's a good desk." "That is the most insane—" She broke off. A sound that might have been laughter, might have been horror, might have been both. "Are you telling me you're going to work for the Mafia Queen?" "She prefers Caro." "You have lost your mind." "Probably." I looked at the card, the typewriter font, the specific intelligence of someone who remembered exactly what I'd said I wanted and offered it with a desk and a sentence and a single initial. But I haven't lost it in the directions that usually get people into trouble. Prue made a long, considering sound. Then, "Is she going to take care of you?" I thought about juniper and struck flint, warmer at the edges each day. I thought about 7 instances of remembered details returned as food, as fresh ginger, as a soup made close to a memory I'd mentioned in passing once to someone she'd never met, in a room she'd never been in. "Yes," I said. "I think she is." I started on a Monday, because I had always started on Mondays. The office on the 43rd floor was the same glass-walled room, and Bex Hartwell was standing outside it when I arrived at 7 a.m. with my audit bag over my shoulder and a coffee I'd made at home because the building's kitchen coffee was reliably inadequate. Bex looked at the coffee. She looked at me. Her scar bisected the corner of what was, carefully, a smile. "In 15 years," she said, "I have never seen her set an office aside for someone." "It's a temporary arrangement." "No," Beck said, with the certainty of someone who had 15 years of pattern recognition to draw from. "It isn't." She walked away before I could respond. I went into the office. The desk was the same desk. The files arranged on it were new, a preliminary internal investigation scope, flagged by the legal team, waiting for a forensic eye that could see the pattern before the lawyers could articulate it. Clean, open, genuinely mine. At 9:15, Vesna Caro appeared in the doorway. She looked at me in the chair. I looked at her in the door. The juniper and flint scent moved through the office like a front arriving, and I had stopped pretending the thing it did to my own scent. The warmth that rose through the suppressants I'd been gradually deprioritizing over the past 6 weeks. The pear and warm sugar wave that she would be able to smell from the threshold was professional neutrality. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early on new assignments." "This isn't a new assignment." "No," I said. "It's a permanent one." She was still for a moment. Her thumb moved once across the inside of her opposite wrist. Then she walked into the office, and she sat in the chair across from the desk. Her chair, now, I realized, in the way that things gradually become what they were always going to be. And she looked at the files. And she looked at my face. And she said, very quietly, "You found every thread I tried to hide." "I follow threads." "And what did you find?" I could have answered professionally. I could have given her the compliance summary. Instead, I said, "Someone who builds fast and documents late because she's always moving faster than the world has a structure for. Someone who hides the things she's proud of so the people she's protecting stay safe. Someone who reads pre-engagement questionnaires all the way to the bottom and sends fresh ginger to a stranger's desk because a stranger mentioned it once in a different room." She looked at her hand on the edge of the desk. The same gesture as day 4. Unconscious, private. The thumb against the wood grain. "Those are accounting findings," she said. "No," I said. "Those are character findings." The room was very quiet. Through the glass, the 43rd floor moved in its ordinary morning rhythms. Associates with coffee cups, phones ringing at distant desks, the low percussion of a building doing its work. Inside the glass, something else entirely was happening. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Not the words I'd expected from the Mafia queen, the empire builder, the woman whose stillness cost more than shouting. But they were true words, which was why she was saying them. I was already learning that she only said true things, even when the truth was complicated, and even when it cost her something to say. "Neither do I said. "I'm usually better at finding how things work than at being inside them while they're working." "We have that in common." "We have several things in common." She looked up. The storm sky color of her eyes, 40 seconds before committing to a direction. "What would you like to do about that?" she said. "I'd like to follow the thread," I said. "All the way to where it goes." Vesna Caro was still for a long time. Then she placed her hand on the desk, not at the edge, but flat against the surface, open, and she said, "Then we'll start there." We started there. We started slowly and carefully, and with the deliberateness of two people who had both learned, in different architectures of loss, that building fast without the structure to hold it costs you later. She showed me the organization from the inside, not the public empire, but the working body of it. The people she'd built loyalty into over years, the decisions she'd made at 23 and 25 and 30 that had seemed like expediency and turned out to be foundation. I showed her the threads I followed, The way a number 3 rows from the edge of a ledger could carry a story if you knew how to read the weight distribution. The way a gap in documentation was its own kind of document. We worked in the same building and we ate lunch in the same room, and sometimes, increasingly, in her office rather than mine, because her office had a window that faced the water, and mine faced the building's interior atrium, and the water was more honest at this time of year. The scent between us stopped being a professional thing to manage and became a private geography instead. Her juniper and struck flint always there when she was near, my pear and warm sugar rising to meet it, in a way I'd stopped suppressing, because suppressing it was exhausting, and also, as Bex had observed with characteristic directness one afternoon, completely pointless, in case you were wondering. The first time she touched me with intention, we were in her car after a late investigation meeting, the two of us in the back seat, the city moving past the windows in the dark, and she reached across the space between us and placed her hand over mine where it rested on the seat. That was all. Her hand over mine, warm and deliberate, the calloused edge of her thumb against my knuckle. She looked out the window. I looked at our hands. Neither of us said anything for a full city block. Then I turned my hand over. She looked down. She looked at our hands, mine open, hers settling into it, fingers folding one by one with the same careful precision she applied to everything that mattered. "Is this all right?" she said. "Yes," I said. "This is very all right." She held my hand for the rest of the drive. When we arrived at the building where I lived, she walked me to the door of my apartment and she stood in the hallway and she said, "I'll see you tomorrow." "You'll see me tomorrow," I agreed. She turned to go. Then she stopped, and she turned back, and she looked at me with the recognition expression, the one I'd finally named on day 4 of the audit and hadn't stopped cataloging since. And she said, "There's something I need to tell you." I waited. I knew within the first 2 hours of the audit that you were going to find everything. The scent analysis on the compliance file was, "Your work is unmistakable, once you know how it's shaped." She paused. I could have ended the engagement. I had grounds. I chose not to. Because of the bet. No. A pause. Before I knew about the bet, I could have sent you back to Meridian with a technical objection. I didn't. Her thumb moved once against her opposite wrist. I wanted to see where the thread went. I looked at her in the hallway light, which was doing its honest best despite being a hallway light. Juniper and struck flint, warm at the edges. "It went here," I said. "Yes," she said. "It did." She left. I went inside and stood in my kitchen for a while, looking at nothing in particular. And I thought about threads followed all the way to where they go. And I thought about a woman who had been 23 years old and closing a 7-figure deal while burying her mother. And I thought about pear and warm sugar scent rising to meet something it recognized, and the specific word for the thing that happens when the chronically overlooked is finally, fully seen. I did not need to find the word. I already knew it. 3 months moved in the way that good time moves, not slowly and not fast, but with the specific quality of time that is being used fully, of days that are denser than the days that preceded them. There were investigations opened and closed and opened again. There were morning briefings in the 43rd floor war room that I now attended as a member of the table rather than a subject of its assessment. There were evenings in her office, at the window facing the water, with the city doing its reliable business below, and two people unlearning the distances they'd built around themselves with the care of people dismantling structures that had served their purpose and now needed to come down cleanly. There was a night in her kitchen, a kitchen in the penthouse at the top of the building, a room that would have appeared excessive except that she cooked in it herself, badly, with the focused frustration of someone who approaches every problem as a competence failure rather than a preference. When she attempted to make the braised greens from the day one lunch and produce something technically identifiable as food and culinarily questionable in every other dimension. I ate it without comment. It was terrible. It was also the meal she'd been trying to replicate for me from memory because I'd mentioned once that it had been the first thing in a long time that had made me feel like someone was paying attention. "It's better than the first attempt," I said. "The first attempt I threw out before you could see it." "Then you've improved considerably." She looked at the dish. She looked at me. Something loosened in her face in the way it only did when there was no one watching except me. "You're being kind." "I'm being accurate. The flavor profile is present. The texture needs work." She made the small, brief, genuine sound. The pressure release laugh I'd first heard in the war room across the bet that had changed everything. I had come to live for it. Not because it was rare, though it was, but because it was real in the specific way that nothing performed can be. I cleaned up the kitchen while she stood at the window, and I watched her reflection in the glass, and I thought, this is what the thread goes to. This woman standing at a window in a kitchen where she can't cook, at the end of an empire she built because no one else was going to. Finally, in a room where she is allowed to be imprecise. She turned from the window and caught me watching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "Just looking." She held my gaze. The storm sky eyes, the stillness, the burn of juniper underneath the controlled register. And then she walked across the kitchen and she put her hands on either side of my face and she said, very quietly, "Tell me to stop, and I will." "Don't stop," I said. She kissed me with the deliberateness she applied to everything she decided was worth doing, and I felt the bond signature in my scent glands flare. Not the biological imperative, which had been present since day 5 if I was honest, but the chosen thing, the thing that happens when you are ready for it to happen. And she pulled back by a fraction and looked at my face with the recognition expression at full intensity. "I know," she said. She was answering something I hadn't said aloud. "I know." "The bond," I said. "That would be, we should—" "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight is just this." Tonight was just this, and it was enough, and it was the beginning of what came after. What came after took its own time. The claiming bond, when it came, was preceded by a conversation that lasted 3 hours and covered, in order, what I needed to understand about the permanence of the mark, what she needed to know about my understanding of what it meant to her and to what the organization would read in it, whether I wanted a formal ceremony or a private one, whether Prue needed to be present because she would absolutely be furious if excluded, and whether the words we exchanged should be written in advance or spoken from whatever we had in us when the moment came. "Written," I said. "You think in drafts. So do I." She looked at me. "You know that about me." "I know most things about you. I've been following the threads." She was quiet. Then, "Written then." She wrote hers in the kitchen at 2 a.m, which I know because I was there, doing the same, and we agreed not to share them until the moment, because it was the one surprise left that we could give each other. We agreed to do it at the penthouse, with the window facing the water, because some settings claim themselves. We agreed on a Tuesday, which was when everything in Vesna Caro's world started. The weekly briefings, the ledgers reviewed, the decisions made. And this was the most important beginning. Bex was there. because she had been present for every significant event in Vesna Caro's professional life for 15 years. And this was not, by any useful definition, purely professional. But it was hers to be present for regardless. Prue was there, having arrived the night before on a train from Callaway, appearing at the penthouse door in her nursing program hoodie with a bottle of cheap champagne and the expression of someone trying very hard to look like this was a normal occurrence. "She's really that one," Prue told me privately, in the kitchen, while Vesna was in the other room being assessed at close range by Bex. "Right? You know she's that one." "I know she's that one." "Okay." Prue handed me the champagne. "Then I approve. For the record. The record being the universe and everyone in it." We stood at the window in the early light, Tuesday morning, the water doing what water does with early light, which is hold it differently than land does, more openly. Vesna spoke first. Her voice was the even declarative register she used for things she'd fully decided, and her words, when they came, were built from the remembered details the same way all her significant gestures were built. Specific, humble, impossible to mistake for anything generic. She said, "I remember a woman who counted seconds and exits and floors because no one else was keeping track. I want to be someone who keeps track alongside her, for as long as she'll allow it. I want to be the reason she stops counting exits." A pause. "I want to be worth trusting with the number." I said, "I followed every thread in your life that I could find, and every one of them led back to someone who built things to last and protected the people inside them and refused to let the world decide what she was made of. I want to be inside what you build. I want to be part of the structure. I want, very specifically, to cook better than you in your own kitchen for the foreseeable future." Bex made the sound. Prue made a different sound. Vesna Caro looked at me with everything in her face that she had been spending 2 decades learning not to show. And she showed it. "Tell me to stop," she said. "Don't stop," I said. The claiming mark landed at the curve of my scent gland, precise and chosen. And the bond snap was not the freight train force the myths describe, but something quieter and more permanent. A door opening between 2 rooms that had always been adjacent, the recognition of each other's interior weather through a channel that asked for nothing except permission to exist. Through it, I felt her, the enormity of her feeling, held in check for so long it had become structural, now released in the direction of a single person with the full force of everything she'd withheld from everyone else. I held her face in my hands. She was shaking slightly, the contained, precise shaking of someone who has been very controlled for a very long time and has just put the control down. "I've got you," I said. "I know," she said. "That's new." Prue cried and denied crying. Bex produced champagne glasses from somewhere and poured the cheap champagne into them with the grave ceremony of someone who understood that the vessel was beside the point. We drank in the morning light at the window, the 4 of us, with the water below holding the light the way it does. 6 months later, Mirella Stoss was convicted on 4 counts of corporate espionage and securities fraud and sentenced to 7 years. She gave a statement in which she said that she'd been building the regulatory case for 18 months, that she'd identified Gervin as a potential asset at an industry event 14 months prior, and that the audit engagement had represented what she'd calculated as the optimal moment to deploy the partial findings leak. She had not calculated for the possibility that the auditor would be too far ahead of the leak by the time it was deployed. The court record notes that when the prosecuting attorney read this section of the evidentiary timeline aloud, the part where the auditor's position in the complete file made the partial leak moot. Morella Stos looked at the table for a long time without expression. Gervin received a suspended sentence, cooperation credit, and a referral to a financial rehabilitation program. He sent a letter, formal, brief, directed to Vesna Caro's legal team that contained, at the end, a single sentence I wasn't meant to see, but did because Vesna showed it to me without comment. I didn't know she would last. The scholarship fund was restructured using 3 of the 5 legal anonymization mechanisms I'd identified on day 4 of the audit. The annual disbursement increased by 30% in the first year of the new structure because visible compliance made expansion possible. 11 Omega children in the first cohort under the new structure received full educational grants in the spring semester. I know their first names because Vesna knows their first names. She has always known their first names, and she told me each one the night the first disbursement went out, sitting at the kitchen counter with a glass of water and a list printed on plain paper, reading quietly, the way you read things that you want to make real by saying aloud. Prue graduated from Callaway State in May, first in her clinical cohort, and she cried exactly as much as she'd denied she would cry, and she sent a photo labeled "Successfully a Nurse, officially can never be grossed out again," and underneath it, "Thank you." The loan on my name was paid off in the 3rd month after I joined the Caro Group, because the salary of the head of internal fraud investigation at a major private organization is not comparable to the salary of a contract forensic accountant at Meridian Audit Group, and because Vesna had offered to pay it the day I accepted the position, and I had declined, and she had accepted my refusal, and then watched, without comment, while I paid it myself, which she told me later was the moment she understood completely. Bex gave us a gift at the wedding 6 months after the claiming, a framed copy of the 7-day audit schedule, the original one, with a single annotation in her handwriting at day 7. She lasted. Underneath that, in Vesna's hand, added later, she stayed. And underneath that, in mine, added the same night, she counted. It hangs in the office on the 43rd floor to the left of the desk, where I see it every morning when I come in. I always come in early. Some things don't change. One morning in the 2nd year, a Tuesday, because Tuesdays are when this world begins, I found her already at the window when I arrived, which was unusual because she slept later than I did by the precise margin of 40 minutes, a fact I had documented with the same specificity I apply to everything I want to keep. She was standing at the penthouse window with her coffee, looking at the water in the early light, and she didn't hear me come in, and I stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her in the way that I have learned to allow myself to watch things I love, without inventory, without the accountant's instinct to catalog what might be lost. She turned. She saw me. The recognition expression, 2 years in, was no longer something she managed or rationed. It was simply what her face did when it found mine. "You're early," she said. "I'm always early." "I know." She held out her hand. "Come and look at the water." I crossed the room. I took her hand. The bond hummed its private frequency, warm and mapped, the interior weather of 2 people who have stopped keeping the weather a secret from each other. We looked at the water. There is a kind of seeing that most people spend their whole lives one person short of, not the being looked at of surfaces and designations, and the story the world writes about you without your consent, but the being known of everything underneath, the counting, the threads, the Sunday soup, the debts taken on behalf of the people you love, the competence you kept sharp in the dark when no one was watching because you needed it to be sharp when the moment came. The being known that says, "I read the questionnaire all the way to the bottom. I sent the fresh ginger. I set the office aside. I followed the thread." To be found, finally, by someone who finds everything. That is not a small thing. It is the whole thing. It is the only thing the rest was always leading toward. The water held the light held the morning held us. The end.